Picture this. You're hiding in a frozen forest, watching the rails. The ground starts to vibrate beneath your feet. Then you hear it, a low, mechanical growling growing louder by the second. Through the trees, you see something that looks like it crawled out of a nightmare. A fortress on wheels, bristling with cannons and machine guns, its armored hull gleaming like the scales of some prehistoric beast. This isn't just any train. This is a German armored train, and for Soviet partisans operating behind enemy lines, these steel monsters represented their worst nightmare come to life. Welcome back to History Frontier, where we uncover forgotten stories that shaped the greatest conflict in human history. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most terrifying weapons that prowled the Eastern Front, the German armored trains that earned the chilling nickname Steel Ghosts. These weren't your grandfather's locomotives. They were mobile fortresses designed to hunt down partisans and control vast stretches of occupied territory. By the end of this video, you'll understand why even the bravest resistance fighters would rather face a tank than encounter one of these mechanical predators. The story begins in 1941 as German forces smashed deep into Soviet territory during Operation Barbarossa. Within months, the Wehrmacht had captured thousands of miles of railway lines, the lifelines that kept the massive Eastern Front supplied. But controlling territory on a map is one thing. Actually securing it is another matter entirely. As German forces pushed deeper into Russia, their supply lines stretched like rubber bands, vulnerable and exposed. Behind their advancing armies, something dangerous was stirring in the forests and swamps. Soviet partisans were beginning to organize. These weren't regular soldiers. They were farmers, teachers, factory workers who would stay behind when the Red Army retreated. Armed with whatever weapons they could scrounge, they began striking at German supply lines. Their favorite targets? Railway tracks, bridges, and supply trains. A few well-placed explosives could derail an entire ammunition shipment or strand a troop transport in the middle of nowhere. The Germans quickly realized they had a serious problem. Traditional patrols couldn't cover the thousands of miles of track winding through hostile territory. Static guard posts could protect specific points, but partisans simply struck elsewhere. They needed something mobile, something that could patrol the railways and respond quickly to threats. They needed armored trains. Now, armored trains weren't a German invention. They'd been used in various conflicts since the late 1800s. But the Germans took the concept and perfected it with typical Teutonic efficiency. Their armored trains were engineering marvels and instruments of terror. Let me paint you a picture of what these steel beasts looked like. The typical German armored train was a segmented nightmare stretching over 300 feet long. At the front and rear, heavily armored locomotives provided power and protection. Between them rolled a collection of specially designed rail cars that transformed the entire train into a mobile fortress. The command cars served as the brain of the operation, bristling with radio antennas. It coordinated not just the train's activities, but often directed broader anti-partisan operations across entire regions. The artillery cars were the muscle. Some mounted anti-aircraft guns that could be depressed to fire horizontally. Others carried howitzers or even tank turrets salvaged from damaged panzers. But perhaps most feared were the infantry cars. These weren't simple troop transports. They featured firing ports along the sides, allowing soldiers to pour devastating machine gun fire from protected positions. Some cars had retractable sections that could deploy troops rapidly while providing covering fire. Imagine being a partisan hiding in the tree line, watching his armored shutters suddenly drop open and the barrel of an MG-42 swings toward your position. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Partisans were used to hit-and-run tactics. They'd strike quickly, inflict damage, then melt back into the forest before German forces could respond. But armored trains changed the equation completely. These weren't static targets or slow-moving convoys. They were predators that could race along the rails at speeds up to 60 miles per hour, arrive at an attack site within minutes, and unleash overwhelming firepower. More terrifying still was their unpredictability. Unlike regular supply trains that ran on schedules, armored trains patrolled randomly. A partisan group might spend days planning an ambush, only to have their carefully laid explosives discovered by an armored train that appeared without warning. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical destruction these trains could deliver. One of the most infamous armored trains was designated BP-44, operating along the critical supply line between Smolensk and Vyazma. Soviet records describe it as a steel demon that seemed to appear wherever partisan activity was heaviest. The train's commander, Hauptmann Ernst Weber, had developed tactics that maximized psychological terror. Instead of simply patrolling, BP-44 would sometimes stop at villages suspected of harboring partisans and demand information. If the villagers couldn't or wouldn't provide intelligence about partisan movements, the train's artillery would systematically destroy buildings until cooperation was forthcoming. The armored train's crew had refined their anti-partisan techniques into a deadly science. When they received reports of track damage or partisan activity, they would approach the area at high speed, using the locomotive's momentum to burst through minor obstacles. As they neared the suspected location, the train would brake hard, with gunners already at their positions, ready to lay down suppressing fire on both sides of the track simultaneously. But the real terror began when the train stopped and deployed its troops. These weren't regular infantry. They were specialists trained in forest warfare and partisan hunting. They knew how to read tracks, how to spot camouflage positions, how to use the train's weapons to flush partisans from cover. Working in coordination with the train's artillery, these troops could sweep large areas of forest, driving any hidden partisans toward prepared kill zones. The partisans quickly learned that conventional ambush tactics were suicide against armored trains. Early resistance groups that tried to attack these steel monsters with the same techniques they used against regular trains were slaughtered. The partisan memoir of Ivan Kozlov, a Soviet resistance leader, describes his group's first encounter with an armored train as like attacking a moving castle with slingshots. However, the partisans were nothing if not adaptable. They began developing new tactics specifically for dealing with these armored predators. Since direct assault was impossible, they focused on indirect methods. Heavy mining became their specialty, not just placing a few explosives under the rails, but creating massive charges that could derail even the heaviest armored locomotive. The most successful partisan technique was a coordinated demolition. Teams would plant multiple charges along a stretch of track, timing the explosions to catch the train at maximum speed when it couldn't brake in time. Some partisan groups became so skilled at these operations that they could calculate exactly where a derailed armored train would come to rest, pre-positioning snipers and anti-tank weapons to engage the crew as they tried to escape the wreckage. Weather became the partisans' greatest ally. During the harsh Russian winter, armored trains faced unique vulnerabilities. Ice could jam turret mechanisms, extreme cold could cause equipment failures, and snow drifts could strand even the most powerful locomotive. Partisan groups learned to time their attacks for the worst weather, when the train's technological advantages were neutralized and their crews were focused on basic survival rather than hunting enemies. One of the most dramatic confrontations occurred in January 1943, when the partisan brigade led by Alexei Fedorov encountered armored train number BP-32 near Karasin. Fedorov's group had been tracking the train for weeks, learning its patrol patterns and identifying its vulnerabilities. They discovered that the train always slowed at a particular curve due to track conditions damaged by earlier partisan sabotage. The partisans spent 3 days preparing their ambush. They placed a massive mine consisting of over 200 pounds of explosives at the curve, but instead of trying to destroy the train outright, they positioned the charge to derail it without causing catastrophic damage. Their goal wasn't destruction, it was capture. When BP-32 hit the mine, the locomotive and first 2 cars derailed but remained largely intact. As the German crew scrambled to assess the damage and organize a defense, Fedorov's partisans attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, using captured German weapons and uniforms. They initially confused the train's defenders about where the real threat was coming from. The battle lasted 6 hours. The German crew fought with desperate courage, using the train's weapons to hold off attackers while radioing for reinforcement. But the partisans had anticipated this, jamming radio frequencies and blocking nearby roads to prevent rescue attempts. By dawn, BP-32 was in partisan hands, along with its weapons, ammunition, and most importantly, its communication equipment and code books. The capture of BP WW2 marked a turning point in the secret war between partisans and armored trains. Soviet intelligence used the captured codes to intercept German communications, allowing other partisan groups to anticipate armored train movements and avoid detection. More significantly, the victory proved that these steel monsters weren't invincible. Word of Federal success spread to the partisan underground like wildfire. Other resistance groups began adopting similar tactics, focusing on derailment and capture rather than destruction. The psychological impact was enormous. The hunters had become the hunted. The Germans responded by upgrading their armored trains with better armor, more powerful weapons, and improved communication security. They also began operating trains in pairs when possible, making capture attempts far more dangerous for partisan groups. Some trains were equipped with specialized cars designed to quickly repair track damage, reducing the time they remained vulnerable after derailment. But perhaps the most sinister German response was the deployment of false flag operations. They began sending captured or reconstructed trains manned by German crews dressed as partisans into areas of heavy resistance activity. When these trains were attacked by genuine partisan groups, the disguised German crews would spring their trap, using the element of surprise to devastating effect. The cat-and-mouse game between armored trains and partisans continued throughout 1943 and into 1944. Each side adapted and counter-adapted, developing new tactics and technologies. German trains began carrying specialized equipment for detecting buried mines, while partisans developed more sophisticated timing devices and remote detonation systems. Some of the most innovative partisan tactics involved psychological warfare turned back against the Germans. Knowing that armored train crews relied heavily on local intelligence, resistance groups began feeding false information to captured or turned collaborators. They would report partisan activity in areas where they had actually placed massive ambushes, luring the armored trains into carefully prepared kill zones. The tide of war gradually turned against the Germans, and with it, the fate of their armored trains. As Soviet forces began pushing westward in late 1943, the railways that had once been German supply lines became contested battlegrounds. Armored trains found themselves caught between advancing Red Army units and increasingly bold partisan attacks. Many armored trains met their end not in dramatic battles, but in strategic withdrawals gone wrong. As German forces retreated, they often had to abandon or destroy their armored trains when tracks were cut behind them or when partisan activity made rail movement impossible. The steel ghosts that had once terrorized the resistance became steel coffins for their crews. The final chapter of the armored train story played out in the chaotic final months of the war. Some trains were captured intact by advancing Soviet forces and pressed into Red Army service. Others were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. A few disappeared entirely, their fate unknown, leading to post-war legends about ghost trains still hidden in forgotten rail yards across Eastern Europe. The legacy of German armored trains extends far beyond their immediate military impact. They represented a unique fusion of 19th century technology with 20th century warfare, mobile fortresses that could project power across vast distances. For the partisans who faced them, they became symbols of both German technological superiority and, ultimately, the limits of that technology when confronted by human courage and ingenuity. Modern military historians recognize armored trains as a fascinating footnote in the evolution of warfare. They were among the last weapon systems to rely primarily on railway infrastructure, making them both powerful and vulnerable. Their success depended entirely on controlling the rails. When that control was contested, their advantages evaporated quickly. The partisan war against armored trains also demonstrated the importance of psychological factors in warfare. The initial terror these trains inspired was real and significant, but once that fear was overcome through successful resistance, they became symbols of German vulnerability rather than strength. The same steel armor that protected the crews also trapped them, limiting their mobility and making them predictable targets for determined opponents. Perhaps most significantly, the struggle between partisans and armored trains illustrated the broader dynamic of the Eastern Front, the clash between German technological superiority and Soviet numerical advantage and determination. The trains represented everything the German military excelled at: precision engineering, tactical innovation, and psychological warfare. But they were ultimately defeated by everything the Soviet resistance embodied: adaptability, persistence, and willingness to sacrifice for ultimate victory. Today, few physical traces of these steel ghosts remain. Some have been preserved in museums, their fearsome weapons now silent, their armor protecting only memories. But in the forests of Eastern Europe, local legends still speak of the trains that brought terror in the night, and of the brave partisans who learned to hunt the hunters. The next time you see a train rolling peacefully through the countryside, remember that railways once carried more than passengers and cargo. They carried the hopes and fears of entire nations and witnessed some of the most desperate and courageous struggles in human history. The steel ghosts of the Eastern Front have long since fallen silent, but their story continues to remind us that in war, no weapon is invincible, and no cause is hopeless as long as brave individuals are willing to stand against tyranny. What other forgotten weapons of World War II would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from history's greatest conflict.